in a senior role or even a leadership role sometimes forget because maybe they don't do the day-to-day job as some of the employees. So I think it's crucial to make sure that, you have some of the frontline staff, available reviewing the demos of the new ERPs that you're looking at going towards.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we will speak with Power Supply Advisory Group member and prior guest on the show, Matt Hoffmann, Materials Management Director at Humboldt County Memorial Hospital. We're going to be talking about an area he knows very well, ERP conversions, but we're going to be talking about the importance of an ERP in critical access and rural hospitals. Those settings, obviously smaller teams, and then often looking at implementing these ERPs. Matt's gotten a lot of activity in his region, reaching out to him for kind of support and guidance, and we were talking about it. And Gary, he said, I think I should come on and kind of talk about some best practices, because a lot of the times when he's getting contacted, people are asking him for tips on how to do a relaunch and a reset on the ERP. So hopefully we'll share some good ideas for how to set it and get it right the first time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what Matt has to say. Second go around. Sounds like he's just diving into that critical access world where mission is even more vital with the limited number of staff that you mentioned, Justin. So looking forward to hearing what he has to say today.
All right. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Matt Hoffmann after this.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
I want to welcome back Matt Hoffmann, Materials Management Director at Humboldt County Memorial Hospital. Matt, you've been on the show before, as I alluded to, by welcoming you back. And then also, you're a member of our advisory group here at Power Supply. And so every month we meet and talk about various topics. We put out an article almost monthly from our discussions and have even created some resources that we like to call the Power Resources, sort of visual representations of processes and concepts and things to be looking out for in the healthcare supply chain. You've been one of our very vocal group members on the advisory. You know, you've got some interesting background, and you also work in critical access rural hospitals. And so, you know, sometimes our conversations can be geared towards a lot of the big systems, big healthcare organizations, but, you know, so not as to not address the challenges that I think are getting even more difficult for critical access in rural hospitals, just related to funding, relating to budget constraints, financial pressures. These are things that I think, you know, we don't talk about always on the show. And I think it's important to make time to really highlight that, because rural communities may be suffering. And so you're going to be talking about some common things today related to ERP conversion. So like leveraging technology, but also knowing many times the supply chain teams are pretty small. As a result, you've got a little bit less networking, a little bit less experience. And a lot of times when you're implementing an ERP, it's the very first time, which means nobody knows, you know, like lessons learned unless they've done it at another hospital and then come to a new facility. You've worked for an ERP. It's kind of like a little mid-career supply chain experience that you've had. And we're going to be talking about specifically to those rural hospitals and critical access hospitals out there, how to avoid the pitfalls of ERP implementation, because the constraints and the margin for error is so small. We want to make sure that you get it as close to right the first time as possible. So with that long intro in mind, Matt.
Oh, I'm exhausted. I'm so
Gary's already
tired.
fallen asleep.
Hayes would have been all over you.
He would have killed me. And fortunately, he's traveling today. Yeah, I've taken some flack on the show recently for my long diatribes, and I did nothing to prevent that. But Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Justin, Gary. I appreciate you guys having me on the show today.
Absolutely.
I think we kind of connected with you on LinkedIn maybe a year and a half ago, something like that. We were specifically looking for, more voices in those rural communities like you bring forward. And, I got to learn a little bit about your background. But for those that didn't listen to your first episode, maybe you could just talk about, your experiences in supply chain and also, working for an ERP company as well through implementations, et cetera.
Sure, Justin. So here I live in rural Iowa. So I've actually worked at 5 critical access hospitals, a couple of them being the biggest critical access hospitals in the state of Iowa. Also, I worked for a big, health system based out of Des Moines. Oversaw the sourcing for 20, hospitals and over 100 clinics that spanned in Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And then after that, I've also worked for an ERP company. I did that for a year, implementing the materials management side of those modules of that ERP system, and then currently went back to working for a critical access hospital. So
I love it. Matt, I love that you bringing that up, and Justin alluded to it in a very detailed informational system intro. But the rural piece really dives me back into mission because you wear so many hats. Like, you don't have a giant team. It's like this person, or maybe that piece is outsourced or that piece is a service that's provided. I mean, you've got to be nimble, right? You got to be nimble and ready to go, right, Matt?
For sure. Most departments, like I said, I worked at 5 different critical access hospitals. The most staff that we ever had was 4 or 5 people. So crazy, isn't it? Like I say before the previous podcast I did with you guys, like I can go from 1 minute being a buyer to, somebody receiving the freight in to, checking contracted stuff. So, in a rural setting, you got to be nimble and you got to be able to adapt to changes. So
for sure.
Yeah, and you may not have gone through a lot of different changes necessarily in your career. I mean, I think a lot of times, I won't say all the time, but I think a lot of times people that are working in supply chain in the, rural hospitals and the rural communities, like that's kind of been their job. They're not really bouncing around like you might see in more urban areas. And a lot of it has to do with you'd have to relocate to do that. And so not everybody wants to have to move their family, for career reasons. But, Matt, I think one of the things that you've noticed in your area is that there really is sort of not a lot of experienced individuals that have gone through an ERP implementation. And one of the reasons we got talking about this after one of our advisory calls was the fact that you're now having people reaching out to you asking for assistance in implementing their ERP so that they get it right, or doing some corrective work after they got a little ways down the road and realized that, maybe they weren't quite getting what they had hoped to get initially. And so can you talk about that landscape a little bit for you? I mean, obviously we're not going to mention any specific locations or anything like that, but talk about maybe some of the reasons why people are coming to you and saying, hey, can you carve out a little bit of time from your day job and help us?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Justin. So literally in the last, we've talked before, last 3 weeks, I had, 5 or 6 different hospitals reach out to me that's implementing the particular ERP system that I worked with previously. I think some of it is they catch wind that, from LinkedIn that I've worked for the company or I have experience implementing the ERP system. So they catch wind of that. Or previously they know they've reached out to me from previous knowledge and, just email me saying, hey, would this be something you're interested in? Or I have, actually recruiters reaching out to me asking if I'd be willing to help them out. So it's coming from many different avenues. And yeah, I can make this a full-time gig if I wanted to, but I kind of like being in the critical access setting, so I take it as a blessing. So
Super cool, Matt, and it's great you have that expertise to share because we talked about the nimbleness of what you need to do. Are you finding that do people stay a long time in rural health, like the leaders of like an ERP implementation, or does it transition and change? And so where it was going one direction, it kind of maybe falls back, and that's where you come in and fill that gap. Is there just a lot of change going on right now in the industry? Are you seeing?
well, I can tell you from where I'm at and stuff like that, there's been a lot of change in supply chain director positions. I think people are getting to that retirement age. I mean, I think they've been in that role for 20 or 30 years, and now they're ready to retire. So I'm telling you, anybody looking into supply chain, especially healthcare, like this is the time to, to really go at it. So
Yeah, I think the whole focus of what we've talked about in the past of materials management used to be in the basement. Now it's really at the C-suite level because it's such a significant expense that it's so important to be there. And then that changing of the guard. This is the way we always did it. And it's change and it's new nimbleness and AI and all the things we talk about moving forward and the change. And so coming in to fill those gaps is a direction that I think you just alluded to.
for sure, for sure. The reason too that I've had a couple is maybe their implementation didn't go the way that they, felt it should have, and they've reached out and, currently working with one to help make sure that the implementation ends on a positive note. So
Yeah, I know we're going to dive into that a lot, like some keys for success in implementing an ERP, especially in a rural setting. But like, why don't you just talk about some of the things that you've been able to accomplish by having one in your current role? Because I think, did you implement the one at where you work currently? And that was this is when you took the job, you immediately implemented it, or was it something you implemented and then you went somewhere else and came back and implemented, came back and took the position?
So I've the current ERP system that I utilize and that I previously worked at, I implemented it twice as a client. So
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so I implemented it previously at another critical access hospital, and then once I came to Humboldt, I implemented it about a year after I started there. So
Got your
remember,
feet
I had
under
to build
you.
that item
Yeah.
master from scratch. Yeah.
Wow.
All right, we're going to dive into the item master.
Can you say that again?
Because,
Did you just say you built an item master from scratch?
From scratch. Could not utilize the previous ERP system. So, yep, it was a dandy. So, and I think that if we can go ahead and dive into it, that's actually one of the things I kind of want to talk about with you guys today is I think one of the issues that, people struggle with their ERP is their current ERP system that they're using, and then they're trying to extract data out of. One, they're not able to, or two, they might not even understand how to extract the proper data that the new ERP system is seeking to have. I've seen that on several implementations.
Yeah, and it's like the setup is so important. So, you know what? Before we get into I think there's a data gathering piece that you're touching on right there. But I also want to talk about some of the other pitfalls just based on the nature of being a smaller facility stressed on resources. And it's something that you kind of pointed out is like you might even have a lot of the pieces in the right places, but then how do you actually carve time out for everybody in the organization to do training? And so I want to start with sort of the training and educational plan is like, how do you get creative around that? And what are some of the challenges that make it difficult? Because even if you set it up perfectly, you have the whole adoption aspect of getting people to utilize it and utilize it the way it's meant to. And a lot of that is training related. Can you dive into that? And then we can get into the cleansing and some KPIs in that area.
Yeah, so that's great. Great topic. So I see that a lot of clients and people that I've helped with previously, that's where they struggle with is actually, setting aside time to actually train in the system to really gain the concept of this is how the new ERP system is going to work and how it's going to be different from their current system. So what I would recommend is what I've done is I set aside a time like in the calendar that I put it on all my employees' calendars. Like, hey, this is the ERP training time. We're going to do this. Like it's mandatory. you set aside an hour or two and you make sure you go through it. Like, hey, this week we're going to go through, this is how you create a purchase order, and then have them test it, make sure that they understand it. Next week you go over, this is how we do a requisition, and then the next week, this is how we receive product. Next week, this is how we build an item in the system. So that's how I broke it down so that my employees understood, like, this is how the system is going to work. So, and it worked. I mean, when we went live with the current ERP system, July 1st, it was a non-event for us. So just really breaking down the training and making sure it's mandatory. Like, you're the leader, like, you're the director of supply chain. It's on you to make sure that your employees are trained. And also, it is the responsibility.
I don't know many people that say ERP go live is a non-event. I mean, the item master thing is a whole other level too, but I've never heard anybody say we implemented an ERP and it was a non-event. And do you think some of that is like the scale? Like, on the one hand, the smaller organization can make it really difficult to carve out time to do the right things. But if you do the right things, it's easier to get to everybody. So, like, a non-event is achievable in that setting, as long as you implement these best practices, in the way you set it up.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you, when I was working for the ERP company, there was 3 hospitals I implemented at the same time in a rural setting. And it was the first time that the ERP was having that done. And 2 out of the 3 were non-events for go lives. And you know why? Those 2 hospitals put in over 100 purchase orders in the test database, over 100 requisitions, 100 receipts. Like, they really tested the system, understood it, asked
questions.
Tried to break it.
Almost tried to break it. Like, yes, we're going to make it break.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, they did it as almost like they were a beta. Yep. Instead of implementing a full-fledged system, they approached it the way companies approach product development cycles and version releasing and things like that. That's really okay. So we're going to get into the testing piece too. You've teed up a couple of like really incredible themes. So I'm going to walk us to the data gathering and like clean data and like some best practices there. And then we can get, into that testing piece. But one thing that I think is pervasive in this conversation that you had brought up to me too, and it kind of ties into training, which was, a change in leadership or a change in staffing due to the ERP conversion. So, like, I'd like you to kind of set the table on that because, I think leadership buy-in is the common theme through every, aspect of our discussion today. So why would there be a change in leadership or staffing turnover related to an ERP conversion? What would cause that?
So let me start off by saying, when I was working for the ERP company, when I would do a new implementation, I'd first off say to them, like, hey, don't be surprised if you lose somebody through this ERP, like an important piece. Yeah. That would be the first thing I would say. Out of the implementations I did when I worked for the ERP system, half the implementations we lost key people like the supply chain directors because, not buying into what the organization is trying to achieve with a new ERP or staffing. Heck, it was even the CFO or the senior leadership that sometimes had turnover. And then that's where, it's like, what direction are they going? So I think the reason that you might see a lot of turnover is, again, there's not support for what the organization is trying to achieve with the new ERP system, or maybe it wasn't communicated, or maybe those individuals weren't even a part of the process, the vetting process for the ERP that the organization was wanting to go to. So I think it's crucial for any organization looking for a new ERP system to make sure that the key people are involved in the decisions.
You were going right there where I was asking, Matt. Transparency, right? People are going to be more part of the team if they know the playbook, right?
For sure. I think that's where you gather support. I mean, they see it and they're like, like, this is what the system can do. Or maybe they have some questions that maybe somebody in a senior role or even a leadership role sometimes forget because maybe they don't do the day-to-day job as some of the employees. So I think it's crucial to make sure that you have some of the frontline staff, available reviewing the demos of the new ERPs that you're looking at going towards.
Well, and the day-to-day stuff could be the data cleansing. And so the manager, as we kind of go into the data piece, may not want to have to dive in. You said you had to build your item master all by yourself. You at least, on the very least, have to reimagine the item master, and you have to clean it for it to be, viable in the new ERP. And so do you think sometimes it's projects like that also, like, certain leaders are just not up for it? Like that, oh, I just do not want to do that.
Well, so again, I implemented this system twice, and I can tell you the first time, there were a lot of times I'd go into work after my kids went to bed and my wife, spend time with my wife. I'd work, 2 hours afterwards just to get the item master cleaned. Now, I was very fortunate this time that, my employees that had, great, great workers and able to attack it, some of it during the day, during my work schedule. So that was kind of a blessing. So I didn't have to stay after work. So I think it's just making sure you're setting aside that time to really review the data, because there's so many times that, people go live, they didn't review the data, and then they're in production, they're using it, they're like, oh, this isn't right. This isn't right. Well, that's the reason you have the test database. That's why you're supposed to be testing the data or, reviewing it to make sure that you're catching this stuff before you're actually utilizing the system at go live.
Do you think a lot of times there's artifact with, an item master that hasn't been cleansed? Like, they're creating items as a workaround for some sort of shortcoming or something they're trying to deal with, or some sort of accommodation of an old process. And the whole reason you're bringing in the ERP is to remove that. And yet there is pushback because people don't necessarily have the vision of how those problems could be removed in the new ERP. So they're almost like hanging on to some of those items or those processes and trying to get people to design the ERP around what it used to be like, not what it's going to be like.
Yeah, I've seen that a couple of times, that it's like, well, my previous system could do this. How can this system? Well, I think the reason you're switching from your current system to the new system is the current system isn't utilizing your efficiency the right way as this new system could. So you're exactly right. Like, there's a reason you're switching to the new system. So why don't you try to understand what can you accomplish in the new system, or ask questions and say, like, hey, in my previous system, I was able to do this. How do I do this in this new ERP? It's really asking the question to make sure you can understand. And most times it's a better, more efficient process with the new ERP.
Do you see, Matt, I remember these days, and you're bringing me back to some repressed memories that I tried to get rid of 35 days straight, 10, 12-hour days. I'll never forget it. And I remember people, miserable because it had to be done. And it was the direction and handed down, and this is where we're going to do it. We had as much transparency as we could. But do you find at some point in time it's like, this kind of is the way it is, and we go live on this date, and that's why you said earlier some people leave, unfortunately, and that's sad, but sometimes natural attrition is part of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're not on the boat, like, and I think you have to make a decision at the senior team level is like, hey, this person owns the boat, and this is the direction we want to head. Like, maybe it's time to cut ties.
So something that you just said, about, creating the clean processes and everything else, and it ties into training as well, but just having adequate time to bring up those use case scenarios and start to frame people's thinking before you get into the data cleansing, before you get into the training. And then I want to go to the testing piece that you talked about earlier. Like, I almost see like that testing. I think you said like 1,000 orders or some 1,000 lines or
yeah, like 100 POs. Yeah.
Yeah. 100 POs. So like, that to me is sort of like the final, like, okay, we've taught people enough, but there's something about going through that last testing step. If it's really robust, and to Gary's point, you're trying to break it, you're actually doing the final sort of tie it all together with everybody that has to utilize the system. It's almost a part of training as well, because it might not be that the ERP isn't working. It may also just be some gaps in training, or maybe they weren't ready to understand it because they didn't have other fundamental elements about how the process is going to work, that it didn't make sense to them in the earlier training, but then when they get to the testing piece, you can refine their experience to another level. And I'm sure there are still things that have to happen in how you're setting up the ERP as well, but I feel like it serves a couple of different purposes. Do you want to talk about the importance of testing and some key areas around that?
Sure, yeah. So the testing, like currently one of the clients I'm working with now, they're doing par restocks and they're having issues with multiple departments being able to, see their par restocks. Well, it came down to if basically the issue is if there's multiple open par restocks from the same department, it basically shut it down so that nobody could use the par restocks. So it's really making sure you understand that, hey, you need to go into the open par restock and fulfill that or submit it. Then you can place a new order, because what you're doing is you're hanging up the rest of the departments from placing their orders. So it's really, if the individuals understood that, tested that, it would alleviate a lot of the issues that now they're experiencing in production. And now that
it's almost like if they were if they were actually able to visualize that, like on the floor of a manufacturing plant assembly line, they would see the bottleneck so clearly. But because it's like in an electronic, more abstract system, it's harder to visualize that bottleneck. Would you agree? Or like,
yeah, I agree with you. But also, I will say, I feel like some of that is also on the ERP system too, like making sure you're communicating like, hey, this function, this is how it operates, and doing teach back, right? Make sure that they actually understand it or actually work through it on the test database and really show them so that they do understand, like, hey, this is how this works. And this is, if you don't do this function the correct way, it can cause issues by, error A, B, C. So I think testing, again, coming down to it, that it's something everybody should do. If you skip it, you're going to cause issues. You're either going to, when you go in production, you're not going to know what you're doing, is one. Two, you're probably going to have to postpone your go live. I've seen that too multiple times. And then you're paying the ERP system for a system you're not even utilizing, which is not good.
Go ahead, Justin.
I was going to say, do you ever see anybody like literally roll back the go live? Like they go live and then they didn't test and then they all of a sudden they unravel it. And like, I think that reset is detrimental to culture.
Yeah. When I was working for the ERP company, we actually had a client that postponed their go live, I think 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, I think a best practice, Matt, would to have Justin come out and let him be part of your ERP go live and to see how Justin does. Sorry,
That'd be miserable.
I am so volunteering, Justin.
I'd learn a ton, though.
Yeah.
So,
oh my gosh.
So I'd welcome it, but you definitely shouldn't put anything of responsibility on my shoulders.
I remember, and I'm just sharing from my practices on this. Like, it felt like we went to boot camp together. It felt like we went to basic training together, and call it what it is. But I mean, we got through it. And once you're on the other side, it feels like such a sense after you've implemented it, you've triaged it, and pieces happen, Matt. It's like it almost brings your team closer together. Like, because you went through it together, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Even I would say I even gained friends from the ERP system when I was implementing as a client, because you work hand in hand together. So it's a great thing. So to leverage that as well. So
100%. Matt, I was going to ask you a question too. Like, how important it's a 2-part question. How important is it, and who usually runs point as the PM of the accountability? Like, if you're going on this is our Tuesday call at 8 a.m. Here's the list of what we're getting done and who's identified. Who really runs point on that, and how important is that PM role to make sure things are moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so the list, that's usually done by the ERP company. Usually is the person that runs that meeting, and they also usually provide a PM for each of the client's projects. So when I was implementing the ERP system, we had we had the same PM, but 2 different meetings, one for finance and the other for supply chain. So that's usually how the meetings ran. So.
Yep, get it.
But
that PM
on the
huge,
hospital side, it's usually you have a dedicated point, and a lot of times that's the senior leader that really it rolls up to
all day long.
I want to talk about kind of like the need for a consultant. And we've had a podcast not too long ago, a little bit around that. But I mean, you have the hospital staff that kind of know their hospital and the people. And then you have the ERP vendor who really knows their product and knows the features. But you almost need somebody who's kind of triangulated with that to sort of understand how to translate between those two parties to get where you need to go, right? And so, I think primarily for the rural setting and critical access hospitals, like what are some qualifying questions for the ERP vendor? Because I do think a lot of times people just think like, oh, we'll get that and they'll give us all the resources. And like every contract I've ever seen, they underestimate the amount of hours that's going to be required. And, I feel like that's another area where a consultant can come in and say, hey, if we were to benchmark you, this is really, and knowing you and how you compare to other clients we've worked with, this is the amount of hours. But there's almost like during that initial procurement process, nobody wants a number that's so big that they don't move forward with the ERP. And then they wind up like, oh, wait a second, we're going to need triple those amount of hours to pull this off. And so kind of wondering, Matt, like what questions should people be asking of their ERP vendor? And, how do like potentially consultants come in and advocate?
Sure. So I think, it's dependent on the ERP system and how they charge and stuff like that. Like the one that I worked for and that I implemented, it's based on licensing structure. So that would be the first thing to really look at. Like how many licenses are you really going to need for implementing the ERP? Like when I mean licenses, I mean how many accounting licenses, how many supply chain licenses are you going to need? The second thing is like, what are you really trying to accomplish? Like, are you going to implement barcoding? Do you currently have barcoding? Because that's another fee. Do you have EDI? Do you not have EDI? So, I mean, there's additional costs right there just looking at it. So it's really, I would say for the first thing is like, as an organization, what are you trying to accomplish? That would be the first question. And then that way we can really go down the path of like, hey, this is what this hospital or this organization needs. Do up a quote and let's see where we end up at it. And there's usually, you can, usually negotiate with the ERP vendor to get the rate reduced. So I've seen that multiple times where hospitals are able to do that.
Especially if you're going bigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're getting more out of their program, then they have a lot more flexibility with pricing, I would imagine. So what are some questions for the ERP vendor themselves? How do you qualify, during your selection process?
Yeah. So let me ask you this, Jess. Are you saying as a client, like as a hospital choosing a ERP system?
Yeah, as a hospital, like some of the things I think we like one that we talked about that's kind of more obvious is if you're working in a critical access hospital, like, how many critical access hospitals have you worked with, and if you are working with, somebody on implementation, whether they're third party or they're a representative of the ERP vendor themselves, like, do they know the environment? Because it is uniquely different, right? So just wondering, like, other things that you could kind of like qualify in your partner.
Yeah, I would say the first thing too is like, as the ERP vendor, I would ask them is like, okay, what's your strategic goals? Like, what are you guys trying to accomplish as an organization? Like, what are you trying to improve? Like, are you guys looking at improving the materials management or supply chain modules? Are you looking at improve finance? Like, what areas are you guys trying to improve yourselves? So it would be a first thing. The second thing is, again, the list of references of, if I'm working at a critical access hospital, like give me some references of other critical access hospitals that currently utilize your system because I want to ask some questions. I have that happen to me all the time. I have people call me up. At least I have 2 or 3 calls a month of different hospitals reaching out to me about the implementation that I just completed back in July. And, what's the good and what's the bad about, utilizing that particular ERP system. So that'd be one. And then really I would tell them like, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish, as a system or as an organization. is that something you guys are willing to work with us on? Or do you guys have the tools currently in your ERP system to help us accomplish our goals that we're trying to move forward with?
So Matt, I've seen some of these ERP implementations at larger health systems, be multi-year projects to an extent, but what's a realistic time frame for a critical access or rural hospital to implement typically?
So I would say 6 months. So if you're implementing the materials or supply chain modules of a particular ERP, I think 6 months. Finance can usually go a little bit sooner than that, but I think 6 months is a good time frame. I have seen some organizations go a little bit less than that. I've myself implemented a couple hospitals under 6 months, but I think 6 months is, a really good timetable because you're able to test the system thoroughly. The ERP system doesn't feel rushed to get data in there. So you guys can really work through the agenda and what you guys are trying to accomplish together. I've also seen some organizations take longer because of how they want their setups. But again, 6 months is a good time frame.
Great. Matt, you did wonderful. And just for the listening audience out there, if you would like Matt to build your vendor item master from scratch, you just got to reach out.
Terrifying.
I know. I really wish we had video for this episode. If everybody could have seen Matt's face when there's a half second where he thought I was
That's
serious.
I'm glad you didn't say that because I'm working with somebody and I'm betting they're going to want me to do that. So do not.
Oh, yeah. Well, all right, Matt. Great job on the show today. Thanks so much for coming on. You're a ton of fun. You're a great addition. A voice of maybe an underserved area of supply chain in healthcare on our Power Supply Advisory Group. So just want to thank you so much for your contributions there as well. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
That was Matt Hoffmann, Materials Management Director at Humboldt County Memorial Hospital. And Gary, talking about ERP conversions and best practices, some common stumbling points for critical access hospitals. And honestly, one of the things that I think would be most concerning to me in that rural critical access environment is because of the small teams, is how do you sustain the things that you're doing, and how do you have that resiliency as an organization? Because you'd only lose one or two key players, and your supply chain can get significantly disrupted as a result. And so I see why these ERPs are going into play. I mean, one thing that I know Matt didn't talk about during this conversation is, in depth anyway, but he's been able to get a high level of GPO compliance as a result of implementing his ERP, and that's helped him a lot because of limited resources. And obviously, again, like we talked about, the financial pressure, so maximizing the value of that agreement for his organization. But as you continue to work through that, how do you make sure that the business processes that are set up can be sustained if there is turnover? And I just don't know how you do it without an ERP effectively, and we just don't have the wiggle room we used to have.
Yeah, it changes prior processes to new processes, and not only the operational efficiency you're trying to create, that was probably part of the boat that he spoke of that you're going to row, is getting those people to, psychologically take on the new change, and whether they want to be a part of it or they don't want to be a part of the solution, I think is key. So you have natural attrition that we talked about, but I think once you get through it, man, you build a team that is even that much stronger. And it's just, we're in the day and the age where we've got to make those changes. Everybody's looking at their bottom line, and this is one way to make it efficient in a timely manner, especially in that critical access setting was talking about, on an average about 6 months, getting it done and getting it past the finish line to tackle the next project. So I think Matt is definitely an expert in his field and just an exceptional job. I think the listeners would really enjoy this podcast.
All right, everybody. Big thanks to Matt Hoffmann for joining us. And again, all his contributions to the Power Supply Advisory Group. On behalf of Gary and Hayes, who couldn't make it today, a rare MIA for Hayes. He's traveling today. I'm Justin Poulin. Thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.